Hi, Dr. Ron here, and I want to invite you to join our Unstress Health community. Now, like this podcast, it's independent of industry and focuses on taking a holistic approach to human health and to the health of the planet. The two are inseparable. There are so many resources available with membership, including regular live Q&As on specific topics with special guests, including many with our amazing Unstress Health Advisory Panel. Now, we've done hundreds of podcasts, all worth listening to, with some amazing experts on a wide range of topics. Many are world leaders. But with membership, we have our Unstress Lab podcast series, where we take the best of several guests and carefully curate specific topics for episodes which are jam-packed full of valuable insights. So join the Unstress Health community. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel, click on the link below or just visit unstresshealth.com to see what's on offer and join now. I look forward to connecting with you. Hello and welcome to Unstress Health. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Well, today we explore sustainability, biodiversity. We talk about pollination. We talk about bees. Well, my guest is Dr. Judy Friedlander, and she is passionate about all of that and making a huge difference. Judy's expertise and impact in environmental advocacy stems from her varied and professional background in high-level journalism, academia, campaigning, and sustainability research. Now, before founding the Planting Seeds organisation, they can be found at ps.org.au, Planting Seeds, Judy had an impressive media and journalistic career, and we talk about that in this podcast. Judy's passion for environmental issues has always been at the forefront of her work and studies, with much of her media work devoted to sustainability interests and investigations. She has a PhD from the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, and has combined that with many years of experience in the world of media and communications. She's also a passionate believer in the ability of urban areas to regenerate and increase biodiversity. Look, this is really inspiring about being able to make a difference to the environment in the urban environment. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Dr. Judy Friedlander. Welcome to the show, Judy.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Judy, sustainability has been a subject we've looked at many times on this podcast. And when I was introduced to you, Planting Seeds and the whole B&B Highway, I just had to get you on and talk about what it is. But before we kick off, I was wondering if you might share with us your own journey. You have a PhD in sustainability. How did you get there?
Yes, it's a bit of an unusual one. So my background is journalism. I started off working in newspapers and magazines, worked in television, and basically experienced the whole mass media thing. It was a wonderful job. Worked for the Sun Herald, edited the whole back section of the Sun Herald, I think when it was the biggest AB readership, over 1 million readers every week. So true mass media, worked for the Herald, always interested in environment. You know, I remember when the environmental pages constituted something like 5-6 pages of the Sydney Morning Herald, and I could write about whatever I wanted to. So my background is general news reporting and feature writing, but I was always super fascinated in sustainability and environmental issues. And then I saw what was happening with mass media, and I saw that the papers were shrinking and the environmental section was shrinking, and it was really concerning me. And I thought, because I'd always been interested in the study of media and communication as well, so I went back and I did a master's, which turned into a PhD. I'd already done a previous master's in what was described as interactive multimedia, which was a little bit early for what was happening with social media, but I was very interested in the changes. Anyway, so the PhD effectively became how to engage people with environmental issues using media and communications. And the PhD title ended up being Raising the Agenda of an Inconvenient Message. And I focused on meat production and meat consumption, because I thought that was really inconvenient. So it was called Raising the Agenda of an Inconvenient Message, looking at meat consumption and meat production, because I thought that was really very much an inconvenient message. And people love eating meat. They love eating meat. And so that took me down this interesting journey of communications theories and all sorts of psychology theories and the science behind it as well. So 8 years later, I finished. And of course, the messaging and the learnings don't just apply to meat production. They apply to a lot of different inconvenient messages that apply to the environmental area.
I know you've used, we did a program recently on extinction anxiety, and you've used the term, I know you've used the term infoglut and eco-anxiety. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, yes, I think it's always worthwhile breaking big issues down into frames. So, yes, I talk about infoglut and I talk about eco-anxiety. So there's two big issues that really are afflicting people in how they can relate to environmental issues. One is the infoglut, which is an academic term, which really conveys what it's about. And that is that, of course, we are experiencing an information explosion in so many different media. And even when we walk around, if we become conscious of all the billboards and the messaging and everything else that's constantly flashing images at me, and everyone's always on their phones, as we all know, and there's such an array of media. And then on top of that, we have eco-anxiety. So it's a very interesting area. People are definitely aware that we have massive environmental problems. And we know from here and from overseas, with what's happening with these terrible environmental and weather situations. We know what's happening now in the States with the hurricanes, and we know what's happening here with flooding and the fires that we had so recently. And so it really comes down to basic defense mechanisms that a lot of the time people will either be in denial, they'll switch off, they'll project, they'll do all sorts of things because it's very difficult to deal with. And I was always really fascinated by the fact that bad news sells. People would often ask me that, why is it that people like reading about bad news? In the case of the environment, people don't like reading about bad news. And I believe it's because it afflicts them. Quite often when we read bad news, it's not as if we switch ourselves off, but we are disconnected from a lot of it. We often say, oh, God, that's terrible. Those poor people there, but for the grace of God go I. That's the often quoted comment. But in the case of the environment, you can't say that because we know it's happening around us. So it really, I think, serves to switch people off. There's also another term called solastalgia, which I think is very important. I saw it featured in a social media post on the weekend, and it was used incorrectly. It doesn't refer to climate change. It refers to the loss of species, and it refers to a very deep-seated malaise and depression and concern because people know we are losing species. And if you're an older person like me, I remember as a child, just how rich the biodiversity was just even in my suburb. I remember collecting cicadas. I remember actually koalas in back gardens up in Avalon, all the bogong moths, all the so many millions of little birds around. We know that that's not happening now. On a certain level, people are reacting viscerally. People know from reading as well that we are losing biodiversity, and that is translating to this concern, very deep, often inarticulated concern called solastalgia.
I mean, you've said so much there. The mass, I mean, it's so interesting that you studied mass communication, and that has been redefined in the last 10 years. I mean, talk about mass communication and taking us down rabbit holes that, whereas, 15, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we were all reading 2 or 3 newspapers, we were all seeing 2 or 3 news channels. But now the clickability of bad news takes us down so many rabbit holes. It's not actually surprising that people are anxious because that sells, doesn't it? I mean, talk about bad news selling.
Mm.
That's part of the business model, isn't it?
Mm. And then, of course, people then tend to react very adversely. And if they can't cope with it, then they'll engage with one of these defense mechanisms. I was actually just thinking on the weekend how my basic psychology training really has come to the fore, because if you think about it, there's something like, I don't know now, I can't remember, I think 7 basic defense mechanisms, and they all come to the fore when we think about environmental issues. A lot of the time we'll deny them, we'll sweep them under the carpet, we'll project, we'll get angry. Somebody was saying to me on the weekend that some of the weather forecasters or the Weather Bureau in the States are receiving hate mail because they're being blamed for what's happening with climates and these incidences. So that's a classic example. In relation to media, I guess that's what my PhD was looking at. It was looking at how do you engage people with these big issues, these big environmental issues. And basically, I always laughingly say, yes, I was at it for 8 years, but I can summarize it in a minute, which is essentially
the elevator pitch.
This might be a very short podcast.
That's all right.
Which is essentially, you have to whack people over the head with the facts. They have to understand what the problem is. If they don't understand the problem or the nature or the extent of the problem, they're not going to want to do something about it. But, big but, if you do not simultaneously give them practical, positive, and scalable strategies, if you don't give them the information and the strategies that are scalable and positive, that they can enact locally and that they can also do, knowing that they're joining with others, it's not going to work whacking them over the head with the information. So I'm not going to talk about my Maven theory, which summarizes all this very succinctly.
Go on. You can. You've put it out there. I mean, I like the idea of the whacking on, but I love the idea of the positive outcomes, which is precisely what planting seeds and your whole initiative is all about. But let's whack people on the head first and tell me a bit about the Maven hypotheses.
The Maven strategy.
Strategy.
Yeah, it's a framework, and in actual fact, I think it's all going to be published fairly soon in a journal article. But it essentially stands for, M is for metaframes. I'll go through what all these relate to in a second. A is for actions. V is for values. E is for ethos and evidence. And N is for news, which is a bit surprising, which I'll explain. So when you think about this plethora of information around us, this infoglut, when you want to convince people or educate people or reach people, you have to be really aware of the frames. And as often as not, it's not one frame. You have to think about the different frames and concerns and issues that people have in relation to an issue. So, for example, with meat consumption, people might be concerned about impacts on animal welfare. They might be concerned about the impacts on the environment, and they might be concerned about impacts on their health. So when we formulated a strategy and a program, a campaign, I was working with different campaigns for this. We basically tried to reach all these audiences, and then we'd often come up with an umbrella frame like Meat-Free Mondays or Meat-Free Week or something even broader that would bring in all those different subgroups. When we talk about environmental issues, it's the same thing. And the B&B Highway, which is the initiative that is Planting Seeds' major program, does take that into account. I'll go into that.
We want to get into that, but I'm still keen on this Maven strategy because, it is interesting. You used the meat as an example. You've mentioned it twice now. And I've often felt, should we be blaming the resource or should we be blaming the way the resource is managed? Because there are good examples of animal welfare, positive environment, and positive health outcomes if the meat is managed correctly.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
We still need to reduce our meat intake, but there is a place for meat eating for those people who want to eat meat. You're not going to convince people not to eat meat, and there are health aspects related to that, of course.
Mm-hmm.
That, I guess, comes into the top-down, bottom-up approach.
It's an interesting one too.
That's
I wanted
really
to talk to you about.
We can't
Yeah.
we can't just do everything from the top down. We need to
No.
also, it has to be push-pull. People need to be motivated and change their behaviours, and it's not going to happen just by people telling them to change it. It needs to be an individual and a personal approach as well. So in relation to meat, yes, it's broad. Will I move on to the A in Maven?
Yeah. Let's move on to the A. Action.
Yeah, so I suppose it's pretty self-evident. So when you're encouraging people to do something or you're educating them about an issue, you need to give them actions that they can apply so that they can help as well. So obviously with meat, it's don't eat as much meat. Or with biodiversity, there's certain issues which I'll go into with B&B Highway. With V is a really interesting one, and I love talking about values. And if you're not interested in values, then don't listen. No, you will be interested in values.
None of my listeners, you wouldn't be talking, anybody listening to this is interested in values, Judy. I think I could stick my neck out that far. Go on. Yeah. Values.
Okay, so values are two different sets of values. We have news values and we have other values, personal values, intrinsic and extrinsic values. So I'll start with news values. So, of course, I guess what I'm really talking about is how do you communicate an issue? And I might be talking about news values, but it really applies to any type of communication. So key news values, for example, are things like you need to make it significant. You need to think about using a prominent organisation or person. Sometimes it can be fun and quirky. There's others as well. But key ones are making it relevant to the reader or the listener or those that are engaging and making it significant. Why is it important to them? There's another one called conflict, which is often invoked in news reporting. There's nothing like a bit of emotion and conflict to get people engaged, but when it comes to environmental issues, that's a no-no. My PhD looked into that. And that basically, I won't go into it in too much detail, but it's essentially because, as I was saying before, bad news sells, but it's to do with conflict that is quite often external. But when you're talking about environmental issues, a lot of it's internal. You don't necessarily want to stir that up too much because people then switch off. So it's not good to use the conflict frame. When we talk about other values, so there's this amazing person called Schwartz. He actually used to be a rabbi, but he moved into academia, and he's the father of values theory. And Schwartz has 10, he basically, and the research shows this through thousands of global studies, that people generally have 10 values that are important to them. And they can be divided into intrinsic and extrinsic. So an example of extrinsic are things like power, authority, success. Intrinsic are things like universal values. You have others more that are to do with tradition. They're in the middle. But the theory goes that if you're trying to, and it's not just the theory, there's studies that have looked at this which back it up, that if you're trying to convince people to do something that invokes a larger than self aim or objective, helping nature, helping people who are less fortunate, that type of thing, it doesn't serve your message to invoke extrinsic values. It doesn't serve your message to say, help people who are poor so you get rich, or help climate change by saving money, because it's very short term and it's counterproductive. So there's not enough time to go into it. I think I really super recommend that people look up these fantastic
Yeah.
values, because you will suddenly realize, as I did, oh, that's why I like that person, even though they seem different to me, because there's obviously that value is important to me that I hadn't realized. Anyway, so that's values. E. E is
Ethos.
ethos, so Maven. E is ethos and evidence. So you're not going to convince anyone on an issue unless you've got the evidence. And ethos relates to the institutions, the organisations that are supporting this evidence as well.
Yes. Well, that's a really topical one, isn't it? Having been in healthcare, this preoccupation with evidence-based medicine is obviously a driver for most people's decisions, but where that evidence comes from is a very important part that's often missed.
Yes, it is. It is. I mean, I think that when I was doing my PhD, in fact, the head of media department at UTS said to me, you have to look at Aristotle's theory, rhetoric theory. I thought, why is he recommending something that's thousands of years old? And of course, it became one of the leading frameworks, and a lot of academics talk about rhetoric theory. Okay, it's quite complex, but the three important things are Aristotle said you have to be aware of ethos, pathos, and logos. You think about it, back in the day when Aristotle and others were trying to reach people, they had thousands of people in front of them. We still have thousands of people, but they're not necessarily physically there. Same things apply. Ethos is the institution or the evidence. It's actually the institution. Logos is the facts, and pathos is the emotional component. Anyway, and N in Maven.
Yes.
Now, this is a bit surprising. We know that the media landscape has changed, but news is still really important to get that big message out. So it's still important, for example, if you can get, if you read something in one of your favorite newspapers that's online or not online, or a big news service like the BBC or the New York Times or whatever it is that people read or watch on the other side of things, that still does set the agenda in many ways and what is important. So it's still important to keep that in mind if you're trying to reach people significantly.
Hi, Dr. Ron here, and I want to invite you to join our Unstress Health community. Now, like this podcast, it's independent of industry and focuses on taking a holistic approach to human health and to the health of the planet. The two are inseparable. There are so many resources available with membership, including regular live Q&As on specific topics with special guests, including many with our amazing Unstress Health Advisory panel. Now, we've done hundreds of podcasts, all worth listening to, with some amazing experts on a wide range of topics. Many are world leaders. But with membership, we have our Unstress Lab podcast series, where we take the best of several guests and carefully curate specific topics for episodes which are jam-packed full of valuable insights. So join the Unstress Health community. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel, click on the link below or just visit unstresshealth.com to see what's on offer and join now. I look forward to connecting with you. So when let's come back to the double approach of whacking people with evidence, but also giving them hope. Let's start with you mentioned the bogon moths are gone and cicadas gone. Talk to us a little bit about how are things going?
So I think this is a good way to segue into the B&B Highway. So everything I've just spoken about can be applied to what's happening with pollinators and biodiversity in the urban sense. So the organisation I set up about, 6-7 years ago now, is called Planting Seeds, and the flagship program is called the B&B Highway, and that stands for beds and breakfasts for birds, bees, and biodiversity. And it focuses on pollinators. And as it turns out, a lot of pollinators start with B. So we've got bats and bees and butterflies and beetles. There are others that don't start with B. And it's basically because you can't always talk about a huge issue. You need to focus on issues that are more bite-sized and tangible. And we know that there are species that serve to inspire people. And so bees and biodiversity and butterflies. So the B&B Highway basically is there to encourage people to help pollinators in the urban environment. The premise behind the B&B Highway is that most Australians live in the urban environment and want to do something that they can do in their suburbs and in their cities. We know that this massive percentage of threatened species live in cities. People don't realise that. So the big Australia-wide environmental report that came out 2 years ago, actually stated, I think it's 46% of animals of significance live in urban environments and about 25% of plants, which surprises people. And I always say it's because we live in humans, animals, and we like to live in areas where there's water and nice soils and things like that. So it's the same thing with other species. So we know that what we do in the urban environment can help. And we also know that we are losing plants and pollinators. A lot of people know that we're losing, well, they will often talk about bogong moths because it's something they remember. People love bees. So even though the B&B Highway is about birds and bees and butterflies and beetles and plants and habitats and citizen science, people will say, oh, you're the bee person, which is fine because it serves to be an opportunity to introduce the topic and to talk about the broader issues. Funnily enough, in academia, there's this thing called the windscreen effect or the windshield effect. Right. And what that means is that we say to people, 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever, when people used to go on drives to the country, at the end of the day, you would have this windscreen or windfield that was full of bugs.
Yeah,
and
true. I remember.
We don't have that anymore. And that's actually used or referred to in academia. Unfortunately, we don't have as many studies as we should have to do with insects, but there are certainly certain studies which are incredibly alarming, which talk about this huge decline. I call it a death dive, but anyway, a decline. And pollinators are really important for a number of reasons. So firstly, 1 in 3 bites of food are related to pollinators, many of them insects. They are basically part of the food chain, of course. They help purify soil and water. So this is why we focus on pollinators and why we focus on the urban environment. And we also very much focus on education and actions. It's not just about teaching people things. It's also about giving them skills. So everything we teach, we go outside and we practice, and that's super important as well.
The purification of air and water, did you say? Purification of air and water, pollinators. That's an interesting perspective I hadn't considered.
Yeah, it's basically, the agronomists call it agricultural services or pollinator services. But yes, it's all about this web of life. When we go into the schools or corporates or wherever we go in to educate, we will talk about all these issues and just to explain that it's very complex, but you have to start somewhere.
You mentioned meat before, but I'm guessing also industrial agriculture with the use of herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, fertilizers affecting microbiome in the soil would not be helping any of these pollinators.
Yeah. Well, because when we go into schools or wherever and we talk about the reasons why pollinators are in decline and plants are in decline, we will talk about that too. That's really important. And provide skills and knowledge about how to plant and without using, and how to encourage a rich biodiversity without using chemicals. That's really important as well.
What about the argument whenever, because we've talked about this in our discussions on regenerative agriculture and the ethical use of animals to regenerate and sequester carbon and regenerate soil. What about the argument which says, look, if we didn't use herbicides, pesticides, chemicals, we wouldn't be able to feed the world? What would be your response to that?
Look, I think you have to be a pragmatist. But it's really about discouraging and looking at alternatives as well. I mean, look, it's the same thing with climate change and renewable energies, and people will say you've got to cut out everything now. We know we can't cut out coal immediately, but we are. We're reducing it, and we're actively looking, and we should be actively being encouraged to look at safe alternatives with consensus and agreement and invoking research. It's the same thing with food and agriculture. It's incredibly complex as well.
Do you think the preoccupation with CO2 levels in the atmosphere to bring it down to almost like a one issue topic when we talk about environment has distracted us from the other areas of environmental degradation that have been going on?
Definitely, but I always take heart from my many years working in this field, because I remember working as a journalist for the Herald, and even prior to that, where I was the associate producer of an environmental documentary called Down to Earth. And in those days, we were talking about the ozone layer and the ozone hole, and we actually did something to help. And in fact, I remember telling people that there was this thing called global warming. It wasn't called climate change then. And a lot of the time people didn't want to hear about it, and they stopped inviting me to dinner parties or they'd say, change the subject. And I was very concerned that the issue of climate change way back then in the late 80s and the 90s wasn't being discussed. It is now. And I've believed for a long time that the issue of species extinction and depletion and what's happening with biodiversity is something that has been swept under the carpet. But now it's starting to emerge, which is exciting. So, and there are overlaps. So just last week, I was invited to present at the first Global Nature Positive Summit. And I spoke about the B&B Highway, which was exciting. And there were nearly 1,000 people there. There were, look, it's still early, not early days, early-ish days. And one of the key topics was that we're trying to find consensus on metrics and how we value biodiversity and put a monetary value on it. And we don't necessarily want to go down the same route as what's been happening with carbon credits, which have unfortunately quite often been exploited. But we have to work towards it, and there's a much greater consensus and awareness. And I call it a force of nature, that, we do know we are losing species. And a lot of us also know about these other issues that are associated with it, like, for example, zoonotic diseases. So, of course, a lot of people believe that the reason why things like COVID emerge is because of the fact that we are losing our biodiversity, and that there are certain species that are coming in contact with one another that shouldn't necessarily be coming in contact. So, yes, so biodiversity is starting to be an issue that people are aware of.
You've mentioned why pollination is important and all of that. And I know this might be a basic question, but remind our listener about why biodiversity is so important.
So biodiversity is important because it's part of the rich web of life. We need a whole array of species around us. It's like a big spider's web. You can't just have one part, one strain of, is it a skein? It's a skein, is that the word?
Yeah, you mean the fibre of the
fibre. Everything needs to be entwined. And the research shows that, as I was saying before, if you start losing key species, then unfortunately it tends to be a domino effect with people's health, with health of food supplies, with a whole array of issues. It's very complex. It's what academics like to call a wicked problem. How do you teach and explain a very complex area of science by condensing it into more palatable bites. And I guess that's what we're trying to do when we educate about pollinators and their links to food production, to species richness, other species that are affected by what's happening with water, what's happening with soil and air. And it just serves to be, I suppose, a really good working model to teach people about that richness.
I actually do like that idea of using the spider's web as a metaphor for why biodiversity is so important. I mean, talk about the web of life. As you mentioned, the more the fibres are there, the stronger the web, and the stronger the web of life would be.
Well, I have to say that I was actually asked to write a children's book, which is being published in February by New South Publishing, and it's called The Bee Squad, and it's targeting children from 8 to about 14. And I had to write about all these issues in a way that was, I suppose, more palatable towards a younger audience. So that's the term I came up with. And I was just saying, in fact, to one of the publishers this week that I just think that the book is probably suitable for adults too, because it's such a complex area and you need to, quite often adults just don't know the basic things about biodiversity. I mean, sometimes we'll go into a school or as I said, a corporate site or something and teach people how to plant. Do you know how many people have actually planted something? Not many. A lot of them are lacking confidence. It's just extraordinary.
So tell us about planting seeds and the B&B Highway, and what individuals in our urban environment can do. I mean, you've mentioned planting something. That's a pretty good start, I'm guessing, but go on, tell us more.
Yeah, so the B&B Highway, it's about 4 things, and it's about doing it in clusters as well so that it becomes a corridor. And we say a corridor of learning and a corridor of regeneration. We're actually in over 200 now, B&B sites, and now about to go into our 4th state in South Australia. So we started in New South Wales and Sydney and have spread out, and we're in Brisbane and also in Victoria. And we've just won a big grant with Penfolds to go into Adelaide. So the B&Bs are educational and practical, and we have actually worked with the Department of Education to create our resources for national use and the CSIRO for citizen science for the Atlas of Living Australia. And we start off with an indoor session where we teach people about what's around their local biodiversity. So we will do research on what actually lives in your suburb. And so we actually have people who do all that research for us, and we present it with beautiful resources and slides, and we'll focus on the plants and the ecosystems, the local systems, and the local bird life and insect life around them. And then we'll go outside and we'll do a biodiversity hunt with resources and sheets where people really start looking at their external area with fresh eyes and learn to start identifying things. And the second session is about planting. So we'll talk about, it's a deep dive into, well, what does pollination mean? How does it work? What does photosynthesis mean? What are the differences between plants? Why is it really important to have 3 layers in a garden? So that's a key thing. So organisations like BirdLife Australia are always saying, please plant more little shrubs. We are losing our little birds. And a big reason is because people are either just putting grass or paving and then maybe a few a few trees, that type of thing, and nothing in between. And it's really important to have the 3 layers. So we talk about that. We talk about things like how you need to have plants flowering all through the year. We talk about all the different flower shapes and the way that butterflies like certain landing pads, and bees and hoverflies and beetles and all the different the colours that they see, and the birds and the bats and things like that. And then we go out and we plant. And so we'll give everyone a tube stock. So there's normally 60 to 100 participants, and everybody will plant, and we'll teach the basics about planting. And then the third one is about habitats. And so habitat construction. So people love to do physical things, and they love their nesting boxes, and we might put in a native stingless beehive, which is a revelation to people that there are native bees that live in hives and make honey. And we might make a home for a blue-banded bee, which involves mixing clay and sand together, because we say that people are amazed that there's possibly 2,000 species of bees in Australia.
Yes, that
And
blew me away when I read your notes about that and thought, wow, okay, 2,000 native bee species in Australia.
yeah,
And
there's
you said
2,000.
most of them live in the ground.
Correct, yes. So
Wow.
that's why we focus on the blue-banded bee, because we basically say that there's actually 11 social bees of those 2,000 that make honey and live in hives. But the rest of those 2,000 are solitary. But they're still super important, and they still pollinate, and they do like to hang around together, but they basically lay their eggs. They're sort of solitary in that respect. And so, and the 70% of those solitary insects live in the ground. So, of course, people don't realize that. So that's why we have to also leave areas of clay and dirt for them to lay their little eggs. And we'll focus on a bee like the blue-banded bee, because it's I describe as a charismatic species. It's beautiful to look at. It's called the head banger of the insect kingdom, because it shakes its head 300 times a second to pollinate.
Wow.
It's called a buzz pollinator. And people will say, I've never seen one before. But as soon as you start telling people that they're out there, guess what? They start seeing them.
Wow. And I'm guessing a blue band is a dead giveaway.
Yeah, that's right. And there's 4 blue bands on the female and 5 on the male, and so on and so forth. There's all these interesting facts.
Yeah.
And they pollinate things like tomatoes and all sorts of crops as well. There's interesting research going on in that respect. And the fourth part of the B&B Highway is to do with data. And that's where we've worked with the CSIRO and the Atlas of Living Australia. And so we teach people that with the everyday smartphone that they have, that now is basically a fantastic way of taking observations and uploading them to biodiversity databases. And what we'll do when we do our indoor version or indoor part of this B&B Highway program is we'll pull up a map and we'll show people all the observations that have been made in their suburb. And people are amazed. And it's fascinating what you can learn with iNaturalist and the Atlas of Living Australia. And so now the everyday observation of an average citizen scientist is generally, it's recognised to be almost as good as a professional.
Wow.
And researchers are crying out for people to take more observations so that we can build up that really important knowledge. So that's part of what we do with the B&B Highway as well.
You must do. I mean, I know you've taken this into many schools. The question, it begs the question: why isn't every school in Australia doing this? I mean, I guess that's the aim, is it, Judy?
Yes, I'm glad you said that. Exactly. As Costa said on the program when I was on Gardening Australia, he said, okay, so now we're in 200 plus schools, but there's 10,000 schools in Australia. So
yes,
that's what we're aiming at. So yeah, and the more schools we're in, I suppose more compelling it is, because we can start creating these wonderful corridors. So, for example, we might have 12 schools in Parramatta, which we do have, but we might be able to have 200 schools. And that citizen science thing is also a really nice way that the children can look at the dashboard and they can see all the other schools and they can see what other students have seen in their area. And also because what we do is we do these biodiversity assessments as well. So we'll come in before planting and then a year later come back, and we're basically monitoring, hopefully, that we transfer species from threatened to thriving. So
threatened to thriving, yeah.
So the more schools and the more B&Bs, the more likely it is that we're going to see these fantastic threatened species. And we're starting to have these reports of insects that haven't been seen in the schools ever before. And that's incredibly empowering and positive.
Mm. And I'm guessing companies, corporations, similarly, uh, are getting involved in this. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, they're starting to. I really want to focus on that next year because it's a really great way for companies to, firstly, offer some corporate social responsibility programs. Once upon a
Mm.
time, corporate CSR didn't really talk about environmental programs, but now, of course, they're starting to. And also, for example, a lot of companies have European parents, and this has actually been mandated quite often with companies that they have to integrate environmental programs. And so the Australian um, subsidiaries or the parts of the European parent organisation are coming to us and saying, we love your program, can we implement it? And we can say to them, yes, and we can do it not only in your grounds, but why don't you sponsor 5 schools or 10 schools in
Mm.
your suburb? And then you can really, multiply the impact, can have this fantastic multiplier effect.
Mm, mm. Wow, look, it's just such an exciting initiative. And as you say, apart from whacking people over the head with the bad news, offering them this great avenue of contributing and doing action, taking action is really empowering. Listen, I just wanted to ask you one last question because, we'll obviously have links to planting seeds and the people can find out more about the B&B Highway and take it into their schools. Is that how they would do it? Would they? How would if someone was listening to this and going, "Look, I want to take this into my son or my daughter's schools"? How would I go about doing that?
Fantastic. So, yes, so they can look at our website, which is www.ps for planting seeds, ps.org.au.
Yep.
And then on that site, there's a ton of information about the B&B Highway, there's emails, there's articles, there's all sorts of things there. And they can contact us that way. And we also, if a corporate is interested, we do things like lunch and learns as well. And quite often, it's a type of program that's really applicable to adults as well, learning about citizen science and learning
Absolutely.
about um, plants and pollinators as well. And all that information is actually on the website.
Judy, thank you so much for not only joining us today, but also everything that you are doing and have done and will continue to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, who would have thought 2,000 different species of bees, and most of them, or many of them, live in the ground. But biodiversity, and I love that metaphor for, well, why is it important? And when we think about the spider's web and the web of life, we know that a spider's web is much stronger when all the strands, all the fibers are beautifully constructed and interlocking and give that spider's web incredible strength. Well, the same is true of biodiversity in the web of life that we all find ourselves in. And how wonderful to not only be presented by the problems, but to be offered so many of the solutions. Why this isn't being rolled out to every single one of the 10,000 schools in Australia, one can only wonder, but one can certainly hope. And there is hope that this will in fact be done. And for corporations as well, I mean, talk about making a difference. This is one way of doing that and connecting people with the earth. And this is a theme that we've explored many times on this podcast. We will, of course, have links to planting seeds. That's ps.org.au. And I would encourage you to support that and get out there and encourage your school or corporation to get involved. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. Feeling stressed, overwhelmed? It's time to unstress your life. Join the Unstress Health community and transform stress into strength. Build mental fitness. From self-sabotage to self-mastery. And together, let's not just survive, but thrive. Expert-led courses, curated podcasts, like-minded community and support, and much more. Visit unstresshealth.com today. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The
content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.